when every vote matters. What will sway your opinion?
Well, just 3 weeks to go until all the political talk becomes action and we have the general election. Many of the party manifestos are out. Read them yet? Lots of people want to talk about trust. Are the parties being honest about what they'll spend? And how will all pay for it? Tonight, we're in Scotland's capital city of Edinburgh, home to Scottish Parliament. It welcomes 4 million tourists a year and recently welcomed tens of millions of pounds to the local economy, thanks to Taylor Swift's visit last week. Our audience here reflects the electoral picture across Scotland. Welcome to Question Time. As always, a wide range of views. From the Scottish National Party, we have Kate Forbes. She was Finance Minister in Scotland under Nicola Sturgeon's leadership. Last year, she ran Humza Yousaf very close in the race to become the new First Minister. She then spent a period on the backbenches until last month, when she was made deputy to another new First Minister, John Swinney. Douglas Ross has had a busy week. He resigned as leader of the Scottish Conservatives on Monday, but he remains in the job until after the election. He'll also stand down from his seat in the Scottish Parliament, but only if he wins a Westminster seat on July the 4th. And as Sarwar runs Labour in Scotland, he gave up a career in dentistry to join the political fray in 2010. His party has only 2 Scottish MPs, but all polling evidence suggests there could be a Labour revival here. Stephen Noon spent 20 years in politics, advising then First Minister Alex Salmond before being chief strategist for the Scottish Independence Campaign. After a spell training to be a Jesuit priest, he's now researching devolution. And Iain Anderson was a Conservative all his life, until recently throwing his weight behind Labour. I'm sure we'll find out why. Previously, he was the UK government's first LGBT business champion. Now he advises global organisations on communications and political risk. This year, he carried out a review of business and government for the Labour Party. Welcome to our panellists, welcome to our audience here in Edinburgh. Great to see you, and welcome to you at home. And just to say, as always, but particularly in the run-up to the election, we will have a wide range of views and parties in our panel every week until that day, July the 4th. Bet you all can't wait. Ah, my goodness. Moment of silence and then. Anyway, let's get on with our first question from Margaret Plummer.
Is it honest for parties to claim they can meet their spending commitments when they are to be paid for by fingers-crossed assumptions like increased productivity, efficiency gains, or cracking down on tax avoidance?
I think you might have touched a nerve with the audience there, Margaret. So let's just pick 2 parties. I mean, Conservative and Labour, you've got your manifestos out. SNP, manifesto is yet to come. Both Conservative and Labour say they will save something like £5 billion from cracking down on tax avoidance. You've then got the Institute of Fiscal Studies saying easier said than done. Anas.
Look, we have set out an ambitious plan today because on the 5th of July, people will either wake up to 5 more years of incompetence and economic chaos from Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives, or we can start the journey of change with Labour. And what we've set out today is our first steps, our down payment, if you like, on what we hope will be a decade of renewal for our country. And we've set out where we would raise more income, for example, a windfall tax on the oil and gas giants who are making record profits, closing the non-dom tax loophole on the super rich so we can put more money into our NHS, delivering a new deal for working people that would give a pay rise to over 200,000 Scots who are earning below the genuine living wage right now, and switching on GB Energy, a publicly owned energy generation company that will be headquartered right here in Scotland to make billions of pounds of investment to create more jobs and lower bills for good.
So
that's
coming
the
to
positive alternative that's on offer.
The substance of Margaret's question, and Margaret's not the only person who's saying this. You've got the Institute for Fiscal Studies, but you've got other economists as well, saying there are going to be big cuts on the way. There have to be, unless you increase borrowing, increase taxes, or cut spending to the tune of 10 to 20 billion pounds.
And growth is the other option. And let me just be really clear. Tory austerity has done untold damage to Scotland and the whole of the UK. And I have made it clear, Keir Starmer has made it clear, Rachel Reeves has made it clear, and it's in black and white in our manifesto published today, there will be no return to austerity under a Labour government.
The problem
we are going to raise money through the taxes I've already mentioned. We are going to borrow where we have to invest, and we are going to get growth into our economy. That's the right thing to do, but we only get a chance to do that if we take the opportunity to get rid of a Tory government that's done so much damage, their lies, their sleaze, their corruption, and we get on with changing our country for the better.
The problem is that is essentially what Liz Truss said. Liz Truss said, don't worry about the figures, we're going to do what we want to do.
No, Liz Truss didn't
rhetoric.
follow fiscal rules. That was the problem.
All the independent forecasters and analysts say that the Labour Party is engaged in a conspiracy of silence and not being honest with the Scottish people and the British people about the realities of their spending. Now, where Anna's talks
and also
about
they can't say about the SNP because you haven't got out your manifesto.
Next week.
So they may be saying about that you
The
about you next week.
problem here is that where Labour are increasing some revenue, it's all going towards new projects. So we know that there's already £18 billion worth of cuts on the books that the Tories have introduced, and Labour are doing nothing to reduce that. Now, we know from a Labour spokesperson that all roads lead back to Westminster when it comes to public services in Scotland.
All excuses lead back to Westminster for the SNP.
And that means that we really need to Labour are promising change. And the point that I would make as a member of the SNP is it needs to be real change. Because if it's just a continuation of Tory austerity, all that Anna said was right about the damage of Tory austerity. But if we see 5 more years of Tory austerity wrapped up under a Labour banner, then that is not going to do our public services any good.
Can I just come out really quickly on that? Because from what John Swinney said yesterday, he is proposing income tax rises for people at a time of a cost of living crisis. And I know, Kate, you already support higher taxes for those earning £29,000 a year in the middle of a cost of living crisis, whilst opposing a windfall tax on the oil and gas giants
that could
who are making record profits.
Jobs.
Why do you support higher taxes for nurses but lower taxes for energy giants?
Okay, let me bring that.
The challenge is because of austerity.
The
whole challenge is because of austerity, and the choices that we have
no
made
austerity
has
under Labour.
mitigated some of that. We want an end to austerity, which means getting rid of the Conservatives.
Let's bring in the Conservatives on the panel.
holding Labour's feet to the fire on the fact that they are doubling down on Tory austerity.
From both Annis and Kate is not a direct answer to Margaret's question. So if I can give you a direct answer, yes, I think we can rely on these aims because we do need to tackle tax evasion. Both parties are committed to that.
But what makes you think? What makes you think you can do more of it than you're doing already?
Well, I think we just have to keep doing more. It's
just
£6 billion.
have to.
Well,
it's not the same as being able to do it. That's crossing your fingers, isn't it?
£6 billion we can drive into the economy and into public services to tackle this properly. The other thing we are committed to doing is reducing the size of government. Now, it has ballooned both here in Scotland and across the United Kingdom. And all of that then allows us to look at manifestos that have been published so far. And I'm looking at a Labour manifesto, particularly as someone, I know we're in Edinburgh tonight, but someone who represents a rural part of the country. Agriculture is barely mentioned in the Labour Party manifesto. There's a commitment from the Conservatives to increase agricultural support by almost £1 billion in the next Parliament.
There's also a commitment, there's also a commitment to cut welfare spending by £12 billion. How are you going to do that?
Well, again, that's driving down some of the fraud that we see within welfare.
What about the COVID corruption fraud?
Hang on a minute.
Let's get that money back.
Hang on, let's get an answer to this question.
Let's get that money back.
So where are you going to make the welfare spending cuts of £12 billion?
Well,
who's going to lose out?
We want to ensure those who are most in need get the support. That's why welfare funding is increasing by 6.7% this year.
Some people are not going to get support to the tune of £12 billion.
But as I say, it's already going up by 6.7% this year. So that is helping the most vulnerable in society.
So who's going to lose out? Because clearly someone is going to lose out.
Currently losing out.
Well, Kate,
every third child is currently losing out because both the Conservatives and Labour support the 2-child cap to ensure that families do not benefit when they have more than 2 children.
You were in a debate on Tuesday in the Scottish Parliament where we all agreed that a quarter of children are in Scotland living in poverty. That's after 17 years.
And you lift the 2-child cap and 250,000 children are brought out of poverty overnight.
Let's hear from our audience, because riveting though it is to hear from you, we also want to hear from the audience as well. So, yes, there's someone up there. Yes, at the very back with your hand up, yeah.
I think when I'm looking at this, the thing that concerns me is public services in the UK at the moment are absolutely under the thumb. They are broken. I work in child protection, and every single service I work with is at absolute breaking point. And if the polling is anything close to correct, then Labour will be the next government in the UK. And the revenue-raising measures that they've included are nowhere near radical enough to raise the sums of money that public services need. They're simply wildly underestimating the nature and the extent of the problem.
OK. Woman here.
Hi. Question for Douglas. You proposed the Green Paper on the welfare reforms. Now, what you propose to do is to stop cash payments now for PIP or ADP as it is here in Scotland. That will not help me. What you've said is you will provide direct services to help, which is great. But I already have stuff in the house that does do that for me. My problem is when I want to go out of my house. For example, I was stuck in my house for 2 years while the council put a ramp in for me. Also, COVID. And if I need to go out during the day, I do have daughters that can help me on their day off. But if I need to go to the doctors, hospital appointments, I have to use taxis. And for instance, I live in East Lothian, in Prestonpans. I have to get a taxi to see my paediatrist, and it cost me £32 for a route. That's a lot of money. The things I need, I want to choose myself. I don't want to be... I want to be the same as any other audience member.
How will you want to?
I mean, you know, the Green Paper is to look at how you can help everyone. And I think you're right to say the benefits of direct support, that's hugely important, and to help people as much as possible. I mean, just the example you gave, I was a councillor for 10 years, and I have faced huge blockages in councils to get the upgrades that can give people the freedom that they need. So we need to stop these blockages to make sure a simple request that can really change your life, like putting in a ramp, takes days, not months or years.
Man here.
Yeah.
We're talking about growth in terms of this subject. But the bottom line is that the cost of borrowing is so high. Can't spend.
OK. Iain, to come to the question, Margaret's question, is it honest for parties to claim they can meet their spending commitments when they're to be paid for effectively by crossing their fingers? That's what you're saying, Margaret.
Yeah. So, look, here's the reality of this election, this Westminster election. It's a choice between the blue team or the red team. I've just heard from Douglas a brilliant explanation to you, madam, as to why I can no longer back the Conservative Party. Their sums don't add up anymore. They absolutely don't add up anymore. There's a 12 billion gap in those sums, Douglas, and nobody can properly explain where the money is going to come from.
And you think Labour's sums add up?
So I think...
Because there's other people who don't.
I think that Keir Starmer is absolutely right, that the piece of work I did for Labour on getting investment into this country, I know, Fiona, that beyond this general election, with fiscal credibility, with not chopping and changing policies, with not 9 business secretaries, 7 chancellors, 5 prime ministers and a partridge in a damn pear tree in our politics, we can get our country moving again. And I'm convinced that with a stability and an approach to government which is about integrity and, frankly, not about mates' rates to friends, the economic sun can come towards us. Labour has to move quickly, but I'm convinced it can.
Stephen. Are the parties
so
being honest?
The answer is no. I don't think the politicians are being honest about what's required. So if you own a house and you have to spend money to maintain it, repairs, refreshing, whatever, if you don't spend that money for a couple of years, you can get away with it. If you don't spend the money for 5 years, the house begins to fray at the edges. But if you don't spend the money for 14 years, you start to get cracks in the walls and holes in the roof. And that's the stage we're at just now. Public services, the fabric of public services are cracked. There are massive problems across the health service, education, local government, and it's because we have not been investing enough in public services because of an ideology over these last 14 years, which has seen public service spending squeezed and tax cuts for people who don't need to have tax cuts.
I should point out, Stephen, that given that we're in Edinburgh, that quite a few of these services you're talking about are devolved to
and absolutely.
the Scottish Government and the SNP.
So, I mean, are we tackling the symptoms? Are we addressing the symptoms, or are we addressing the causes? So the problems in the health service and schools, etc., in Scotland are the exact same under the SNP, are the exact same as the problems in the health service in Wales under Labour, are the exact same as the problems in England. And that suggests to me that this isn't a localised problem. It's not the fault of a particular government or a particular colour. It's a systemic fault. We've had an ideological government choosing to squeeze public services, and everybody is paying the price. So there's been lots of figures bandied around tonight. The figure that strikes me most, the Sunday Times Rich List from a few weeks ago, the 10 wealthiest families in the country have seen their wealth increase by 50% to an average of £21 billion each over the last 5 years. Who in this audience has seen their wealth increase by 50% over the last 5 years? And that's the problem. We have a structural problem in this country, and that's why we need real change. So I'm optimistic about a Labour government coming in London, but we have to push them to be bold. We have to push them to go beyond the tinkering, and I think their tax changes are tinkering, to actually make the radical change which is going to fix the structure of our public services.
OK. Hand there in the front. Yes, you, sir.
I just want to say, right, so with taxation, we obviously look at this quite negatively. So if you're increasing tax, you go, this must be bad. But surely the question should be the use of our taxes. So if I had to pay £20 more in tax, but my energy bills were reduced, my transportation bills to get to work were reduced, surely that's what we should be looking at. Rather than saying we need to keep cutting our taxes, we need to keep money low, I'm fine paying more if I got more from it. But obviously, with taxation right now, we don't feel like we are getting anything from it. So that's the issue.
Okay. Woman in the glasses. Woman in the glasses in the white top, yeah.
Yeah, it's just the comment that Stephen made there about needing a structural change. I work in the NHS, and often there is a lot of stuff where we're going to give you lots of money and that will fix the problem. But actually, even if you give us a lot of money, how do you retain the staff that are now completely burnt out after years? And how do you advertise when all we hear constantly is how tough it is to be in the public service? Yes, it is, but it's not much of a selling point for us.
All right. I think, again, that may be a topic we will come back to. Yes, man in the grey sweatshirt, I think you've got on. Yeah.
Isn't the proposed 2% cut in the national insurance rate just a desperate bribe? Wouldn't you be better spending that money on the care service, on the NHS that's on its knees, rather than trying to bribe the British public?
Well, we are spending money. We're increasing the spending on the NHS over the course of the next Parliament, and also it's important that people benefit from tax cuts. We've seen it in the autumn statement and the spring budget. Now, particularly on national insurance, it's important here in Scotland because that delivers for people across the United Kingdom. Other tax cuts that the UK government could have implemented would not have been passed on by the SNP here in Scotland. And to go back to the gentleman in the front row here, we are paying more tax here in Scotland than anywhere else in the United Kingdom, but people are not seeing the benefits in the public services they receive, be it the health service, be it education, be it in local government, be it in the areas where people value those public services most. We are paying more and getting less in Scotland.
Can I bring in on that? Because I absolutely agree that to pay a little bit more, as you are here in Scotland, you have to see return. No. And the fact that we have progressive taxation, just marginal increases on the wealthiest, means that we have the Scottish Child Payment here in Scotland that has lifted 100,000 children out of poverty who would otherwise be in poverty.
Do you think people who earn £30,000 a year consider themselves among the wealthiest?
Because
those are the people who are paying more tax.
In terms of our progressive taxation, what's interesting, HMRC, by all accounts, an independent analyst, have seen that over 4,000 more people are coming to Scotland every year than leaving. And I think it's because people actually care about well-funded public services. They want to see us eradicating poverty. They want to see greater investment in the services that the gentleman at the top talked about when it comes to, for example, child protection.
Do you actually know that's why they're coming here?
We are... Well, the point...
Are you just making that up?
Well, no, the point is that in terms of the analysis, most people are continually saying that slightly higher taxes mean that fewer people are coming to Scotland. And what HMRC can see is that more are coming to Scotland. And the point with all of this is that, at the end of the day, it's trying to mitigate austerity. I would much rather that this was resolved at source. I'd much rather that we weren't facing £18 billion worth of cuts, which amounts to 130,000 nurses in our NHS.
You've made the point about that.
That's the point.
And that is a figure disputed by some.
Real change.
Kate, we want our public services to work.
All right. Let me move on, because there's quite a few questions I want to get through. Let me just tell you about next week, because next week we have a slightly different programme, or the special programme. We will have the leaders of the 4 largest parties, so obviously Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, Ed Davey and John Swinney, on a Question Time Leaders special from York, where the audience will get to put their questions directly to the 4 leaders. So if you want to be in the audience, that's York on the 20th of June, put a question directly, go to the Question Time website, follow the instructions there, and we would love to see you. So that is next week, the 4 leaders answering questions from you. OK, let's take another question, which needs to be answered from you. Tristan Green.
How do we achieve a just transition from oil and gas to clean energy without losing thousands of jobs?
So, Kate, let me come to you first of all on this. Just so I am clear, what is the SNP's position on new oil and gas licences? Are you for them or not for them?
So it's very simple, and I will spell it out very simply. We are for analysing each of the applications for licences on a case-by-case basis. They need to meet...
Are you any the wiser?
Well, I've not finished my answer. I've not finished my answer.
They've heard it before,
And they need to meet 3 tests. The first is about climate compatibility. We are in a climate change emergency. We know that we need to meet our climate change ambitions. It is a priority for voters. So that needs to be taken into account.
So let's just examine that for a minute. Now, hang on. Let's examine that. Let's examine that.
Yeah.
How can a new oil or gas field ever be compatible with climate change requirements? What was the criteria?
If I could illustrate it, we also have 2 other tests. One is
No, answer that question first.
I will, but it's related. Energy security and energy costs. Now, if you have, for example, in the North East, substantial investment...
That's different from climate change compatibility. Purely on climate change compatibility. How can they be compatible?
I am answering your question. In terms
Are you hearing an answer here?
No, because you're not letting me. With the greatest respect, I do need to finish my answer. If you look at where the greatest investment is currently being made in green energy, it is coming from the North East. It's coming from our energy sector. And so that industry itself needs to reinvest. So we are in between Labour and the Conservatives, where on one hand, the Conservatives are wanting to issue hundreds of new licences, which we don't think is compatible. And on the other hand, Labour's position could jeopardise 100,000 jobs, which we cannot.
And you know that figure is
tolerate.
disputed. But just, I still don't understand. Maybe I'm just not getting it. How can new oil and gas fields be compatible with reaching net zero and our climate change responsibilities?
They would need to be analysed on a case-by-case basis.
But how could they be? On what, for instance, how?
Well, I mean, I've already set out that if you speak to the industry right now, they are on a just transition themselves. The gentleman asked, the question was about a just transition.
Yeah, but that means...
A just transition cannot be telling workers who work in the oil and gas industry right now, you're losing your job tomorrow and there might be another one in 10 years' time. That is not a just transition. A just transition needs to take people with us whilst trying to meet our climate change ambitions.
I have to say, I still don't understand how a new oil and gas field can be compatible with your climate change requirements, but do you? No. OK. Anas, how do we achieve a just transition from oil and gas to clean energy without losing thousands of jobs? And that's a question that's being put to Labour.
Absolutely. And I think the important point to say right from the outset, because there'll be lots of people watching the scaremongering worried about their jobs. Let me be really clear. There will be no cliff edge. There will be no turning off the tap. Oil and gas will play a significant role for decades to come. What we're talking about is making the strategic investments we need to make in order to deliver that transition. That means lower bills for good, more jobs, greater energy security, and actually realising Scotland's full energy potential. And we talked earlier on about investment. A windfall tax on the oil and gas giants that Kate opposes, but somehow still supports higher taxes for nurses, would actually help us invest in those technologies of the future. And that's why GB Energy, a publicly owned energy generation company that will be headquartered right here in Scotland, would make billions of pounds of investment in onshore wind, offshore wind, hydrogen, tidal, solar. I believe we should have an open debate about micro-nuclear in this country as well as a baseline of energy security. And we also need to invest where the large-scale jobs are going to come from, and that's in the supply chains. Right now, the supply chain jobs are giving jobs to Norway, to Denmark, to other places. I want those components built here in Scotland, built here in the UK, so we create the jobs here as well as the investments in the ports. That's a future we can achieve together if we take the opportunity on the 4th of July to change away from this government and have a government focused on building and maximising Scotland's potential.
So Labour have given up on the North East of Scotland because the tens of thousands of jobs that are at stake as a result of their policies are cited by Offshore Energies UK, are cited by Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce. These are the expert groups in the North East of Scotland who are warning about the plans that Labour are putting forward. And Anna speaks about GB Energy. GB Energy will produce no energy whatsoever. So I'm not sure how that is going to help us.
The investments.
I'm not sure how that's going to help us with energy security. But I think perhaps the most telling thing is Kate cannot give a straight answer, because the SNP are trying to ride two horses on this one. They are opposed to new oil and gas licences. That's what Kate would say if she was being honest here tonight. And to go back to Tristan's point, I think current new oil and gas licences are important because we still have a demand to meet here in the United Kingdom. And unlike the SNP and Labour, I want to see that demand delivered as close to home as possible, because we know that importing it costs more from foreign governments at a higher carbon footprint, and it also doesn't protect the tens of thousands of jobs in the North Sea and the North East at the moment. And those jobs are going to be absolutely crucial.
And what about the net zero commitments that the government has signed up to? The Climate Change Committee says expansion of fossil fuel production is not in line with net zero. You're just going to ignore that?
No, not at all. But the problem is, and on Tristan's point, these skilled staff in the North Sea just now are the ones we need to propel us to net zero. So I support the net zero targets here for 2045 in Scotland and 2050.
New oil and gas fields as well?
Because otherwise, the only alternative is to import it at a higher cost with a greater carbon footprint. And if we do that, those skilled workers in the North Sea will go elsewhere. They'll go to the other countries to drill for oil and gas, and we will lose those skills that are needed for the transition to net zero.
Woman here in the front.
You said the taps are not going to be closed anytime
You're
soon.
talking to Anas now.
Yes, sorry, yeah. And we have few more decades with oil and gas, but we don't have few more decades. Have you read any sort of scientific articles about climate change and stuff like that?
So what would you like to see happen?
Well, me and my husband, we are trying to do the right choices. We invested in an EV, expensive ones, but there are no EV chargers around.
So you'd like to see the oil and gas fields closed down?
Oh, absolutely,
as soon as possible, irrespective of the cost on jobs?
Well, no. However,
it's tricky.
It is tricky, but if we don't do anything now, yes, people are not going to lose jobs. But
there's a person right at the very back in a blue shirt. Can you see just a bit further back there? Yeah.
We're in the throes of a youth mental health crisis. Just recently, in a large global survey, the EU came second from the bottom. And our young people are being failed. We need drastic action and investment. And I'd like to hear from the panelists what actions they're willing to take and what actions we can see from the next government.
That's a really important question. I'm going to deal with the main question that we're talking about, if you don't mind, which is about oil and gas production, and we may well come to that. Yes, the woman with the glasses and the red hair, yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to Kate's point about looking at each oil and gas field on a case-by-case basis. The world's leading experts say that a safe, livable future for all of us is simply not compatible with any new oil and gas fields. And if we're talking about just transition, I really agree with some of Anas's points that it's vital that those jobs are secured, and instead of given to the Philippines, which is what we've seen in an SNP government, sort of new renewable energy production, I think when we talk about justice, like what is just about a future for people in this country when they're going to be locked into extreme weather, when our air is no longer breathable, when their children's futures are in jeopardy. Let's look at the bigger picture here. Let's not tinker around the edges. We're in a crisis in both climate and nature. Let's start talking about it seriously.
So I think you've actually very eloquently laid out the issue. What the justice element of the transition means is that we are creating jobs for people as we move away from fossil fuels. So in the last few weeks, for example, there have been 2 international companies that have chosen to invest in our renewables. Scotland has huge potential with renewables. We want to be at the forefront when it comes to the green industry, and that's what we're doing. And that's where the justice is, because we talk about a cost of living crisis and we talk about a climate change emergency. You've got to deal with both of them at the same time and not leave people behind. And it's that substantial investment, the creation of thousands of jobs in some of the most deprived areas of Scotland that will make the biggest difference. That's my definition of justice.
Stephen.
So the scale of Scotland's energy opportunity is huge. And what it will allow us to do is not just meet our own climate targets, but potentially help countries like Germany, help the rest of the UK, move away from carbon reliance in their industry, so the hydrogen economy. So it's really important that we get this right. So the image I have in my mind is of a baton being passed in a race, a relay race. And so at the moment, the baton is being held by the oil and gas industry. And people are right, the skills, the expertise, the capacity that is in the oil and gas industry is needed if we're going to maximise our potential in the renewable industry. So we've got to pass on the baton, absolutely. We have to move from oil and gas, but we have to pass it on in the right way. If we pass it too early, we don't maximise our potential. If we pass it too late, it impacts on the climate. So these are difficult decisions for the politicians. So for me, the answer to the original question is we do it by not being rigid. We do it by making judgments based upon what is actually happening in the North Sea. So if we're needing to get another couple of fields licensed, and if that's going to help us move more effectively to the green transition, I'm fine with that, I have to say, because if we do it well, we're helping other countries.
OK. Iain?
So...
Do you agree with that?
You've got an Aberdonian on the panel tonight in Edinburgh. I feel this really deeply, to your exact point, Douglas. But I also kind of pose the question to your point, madam, about what has the Green SNP coalition been doing on this transition journey over the last few years here in Holyrood? I mean, case by case, Kate, sounds pragmatic, but the reality is, from a global investment perspective, if this audience is confused with that answer, you can tell that global investors are going to be completely confused by that answer. So look, I welcome, Anas, you saying no cliff edge. I think that's an important thing to say. I welcome the idea that GB Energy is an investment vehicle. Please commit to making that entity based in Aberdeen. The skills are in Aberdeen. The agglomeration effect for the offshore sector is based in Aberdeen. Let's just get on with it, because I think, if I can pivot away a little bit, Fiona, from elections in this country, if America is about to take a potentially retrograde step in terms of its climate commitments later this year, if it's to dial down on its commitments, and that would be absolutely horrendous if the next president decides to do that. If we can be, as Stephen says, a global leader in transition with an investment vehicle like GB Energy, we can be a leading player, not just for our own environment and economy, but actually on the global stage. And I hope we take this opportunity for our children.
OK. Talking of children, there's a question that lots of you have asked. We touched on it very briefly in a previous programme, but we're going to give it more time because so many of you have asked about it. Louise Gibson, where are you sitting? Oh, there you are.
Is Labour's plan to introduce VAT on private schools a realistic game changer for state education, or a cynical tactic using children as collateral damage?
So Labour's plan to introduce 20% VAT on private school fees. Douglas.
Yeah, well, I think it's the wrong approach. I represent Gordonston, which is a private school in Murray. It's one of our biggest employers and it benefits pupils who go there. But I've also had meetings with the private schools here in Edinburgh and the real concerns about where the pupils would go if they can't afford the plans that Labour are putting forward. So the Conservatives at a UK level and here in Scotland are opposed to that because of the impact it's going to have now and into the future, not just for the private schools, but for the state schools who will not be able to cope with the huge influx of pupils moving into the state sector. And I say that someone who proudly went to state school. You know, my mum was a school cook at the school I went to at Forest Academy, had an outstanding education there. My sister is still a teacher in the school that I went to. But I do think these plans that Labour are putting forward are rightly being opposed here in Edinburgh and in many parts of the country. I know my colleague Greg Hans has done a lot of this down south as well. I don't think it's been thought through by Labour. I think they do see this as a headline that they can get through, but they are not looking at the implications of what they're putting forward.
So, Stephen, let me come to you. And just to set out the context, it's something like 6 or 7% of pupils in the UK are currently in private education. Here in Edinburgh, it's quite an anomaly. It's 25%. Yeah. So it's a very different picture here in this city. Stephen.
So I'm conflicted. I can see why Labour might want to do it. It's good to get money into the private sector. I went to a private school and I really valued what that education gave me. So I suppose what concerns me is the law of unintended consequences. If you prevent people who are not massively wealthy, but people whose families struggle to put them into private school and they then move into the public sector, are you actually getting the benefit that you wish? So I'm persuadable on it, to be honest. I suppose the other question I would have is, if private provision is OK in the health service, why is it not OK in the education service? I think there are just questions around principle to be answered. So if we can see the private sector helping us resolve some of the issues in the health service, why can't we see the private sector being part of the solution within the public sector?
Look, the first question was rightly recognising the terrible state of the public finances we face in this country after 14 years of economic carnage from the Conservatives. And it was rightly highlighting the huge challenges we face in public sector and public service delivery in our country. And the harsh reality is, right now in our state schools, we have record levels of violence. We are seeing our schools fall on the international scores in terms of the PISA scores when we had a once world-renowned education system here in Scotland. We see teacher numbers cut in my home city of Glasgow. They're losing 173 posts in education. And every single day when I meet teachers, I'm told about them in the middle of a cost of living crisis having to spend their own money in order to take more resources into the classroom. And that's why we have taken a balanced decision to remove that VAT exemption from private schools so we can put more money into our state schools. That will benefit state schools in every part of our country, including here in Scotland. It's a difficult decision that we've had to make, but we all accept that our state schools require that investment. And I think that first injection of cash into our state schools is the right choice to make if we are to ensure that every child is able to fulfil their potential. And people say to me often that, parents that send their children to private school have aspiration for their children. Every parent has aspiration for their children, regardless if they go to private school or state school. And too many children are being failed by our state education system, and that's why we have to invest in it.
And Alice, can I just ask you, because there's been some concern expressed by specialist private schools, schools that teach music, schools that teach ballet, the Royal Ballet School, for example. Are you going to take VAT? Are you going to impose VAT on those? So most of the pupils there do not pay themselves, they get grants.
So we have said we would remove the VAT exemption on all private schools.
Including specialist schools like that?
That's my understanding, and we would remove the VAT exemption on all private schools. But it's also worth noting that that's a business providing a service. That does not necessarily mean that business, many of them that do have a surplus in savings, have to pass that on to individual parents or families. That they don't have to make that decision.
Have you heard of the reaction, though, that that's having here in Edinburgh and, you know, across the sector, across Scotland? You must have listened to the concerns and what that will mean for private schools, but also for the state sector.
But Douglas, I have. But I've also listened to all those people who tell me about the tragic circumstances happening in state schools right across our country. And if we accept that the public finances are tough, and if at the same time we accept that our schools require more support, then I think it's incumbent on us to find a solution that allows us to give an immediate injection into those state schools so no child is left behind.
Lots
and that's
of
why
hands
we made
up.
this decision.
Let's hear from some of the people here. So there's a woman with blonde hair. I think you've got a grey cardi on in the middle towards the back. Can you see? Yes, keep your hand up just so we can find you. Oh, there you are. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I'm somewhat conflicted about this question because I was actually educated for part of my schooling in one of Edinburgh's private schools, which were merchant company schools at that time, charging minimum fees, otherwise I couldn't have gone there. But I have spent 30 years teaching in the state sector, and people always raise the question of aspiration with regard to private schools. This policy of adding VAT is not going to hit the truly aspirational parents, the middle classes who are struggling to send their children to private schools. Even less so is it, or even more so, is it going to hit those parents of children with special needs who can't get the effective education that they need in the state sector. It's not going to affect the Eatons, the Harrows, the Winchesters. It's people who are genuinely trying to get a better situation for their children rather than buying them privilege, which I think is some of what the policy is aimed at.
I'll come back to you on that. I'll just go around the other. Woman in the blue check shirt, yes. Yes, in the blue check shirt, the woman there, you've got your hand up. Yes, there's a microphone right over your head.
I mean, I worked hard to send my 3 children to a day school that was private. And I feel that by adding on VAT, you're going to get only the people that can absolutely afford it, which in half of your private schools are coming from abroad. They're not in this country. And I feel that it's quite wrong to take the opportunity from people like myself who want to work hard to try and achieve that. I certainly would never have been able to if there was 20% VAT on it.
OK. Well, the young woman with the blonde hair and the blue top.
We keep talking about middle-class families and folk that are over the edge and can send their kids to private school. We aren't talking about the bottom, the families at the bottom of Scotland, the kids that are in poverty, the kids that parents maybe can't send them to these schools. This money should be going to the bottom so those kids can be levelled up to a similar platform, because if those working class kids are just forgotten about, as they seem to be in this discussion, then what are the aspirations for those kids? What are the aspirations for those parents? Iain.
So look, I mean, like maybe others in this audience, I speak as someone that was educated in both the public system and the private system. So a bit like Stephen, I can see, you know, both sides of this. But I agree with that last comment. I went to a great school. I'm very proud of that school. I support that school. I'm going to continue to support that school. I'm not, you know, going to sit on this panel and disown my independent education. But what I do want to see is great education for every single child. And I think that is the duty of the next government. The reason I think, Fiona, that these kind of choices are having to be made is because of the mess that's being left by this Conservative administration. If the schools in the public system were better funded, ANAS wouldn't have to reach for this lever. They're having to reach for this lever because I think there's an ambition from a new government to provide absolute aspiration, absolute choice, absolute excellence for every child, and that should be
I mean, there
our
could be
ambition.
other levers they'd reach for, but they're choosing to reach for that one. You support it.
And it is a choice. And the thing I would say as well is that as part of the journey of that legislation, I would hope a new government that has better governance, actually does some wide consultation as that legislation is going through.
The consultation is clear.
And Anas, I will come back to you. So, Kate, Louise's question, is it this plan to introduce VAT in private schools, is it a realistic game changer for state education or a cynical tactic? Where are the SNP on VAT on schools?
So we introduced non-domestic rates. We closed a loophole for private schools, which meant that there was an equal playing field between state schools and private schools.
Is that when you got business rate relief?
Yes,
that what
that's
you're talking
right.
about?
But I think taking a step back, this whole policy and the debate we've just had tells you everything you need to know about Labour's plan for public finances, which is it's not thought through, it's tinkering around the edges, and it's targeting soft targets. And what we need... What we need, the most powerful comment, I think, was from the lady in the middle. No, let me finish. The lady in the middle that talked about the fact, at the end of the day, there are too many children in poverty in our country, north and south of the border, across the United Kingdom. And what's going to make the big difference to them is good education, but also ensuring that they have funding in their pocket and that there is access to good employment. And when I think of the opportunity that education presents itself, we do need to make sure that every child has an equality of opportunity. But more than that, we know what is hurting these kids. It's the cost of living crisis, it's spiralling costs, and it's austerity.
OK, we're slightly getting away from the question. Let me just also...
And that requires a bigger vision.
So you don't support it?
Well, I already started by saying where we have... I already started by saying where we have been able to make tax changes, we have.
But just to be clear, sorry, Kate, just because I'm not clear, do you or do you not support this plan to introduce VAT on private schools?
Well, I think we'll make it clear with our own manifesto next week. But I think in terms of the principle, we care about reversing austerity and we care about progressive taxation.
So at the moment, the jury's still out until you produce your manifesto.
But look at our record in terms of what we've done already with the tax rates that we have.
Can I just say, because I wanted to answer directly the lady at the back that talked about the additional support needed in our classrooms. And let's talk about the SNP record. In the last 10 years, the number of pupils in our schools requiring assisted support needs has trebled. And at the same time, under Kate's government, the number of assisted support need teachers in our schools have dropped to a third of the level they were 10 years ago.
Because of the pressure on our public finance.
That is why the additional investment into those children in our state schools is so important. And that's why I'm gobsmacked, actually, that Kate does not want to...
And what you're not doing is answering directly the question by the woman at the back about children that may have to go to private schools, paid for by their parents, because they have special needs that can't be met elsewhere. Are you going to put VAT on those schools as well?
So, look, I would hope, as Iain...
That's what you're asking, isn't it?
I would hope, as Iain has rightly said, that we will take a pragmatic approach in government to make sure we're supporting families that have specific needs. But let's be really clear, there's
you've said it'll be VAT on all
there is
all
lots of people,
schools.
that's my understanding, but there'll be lots
including
of,
those with
there
special
are
needs.
lots of children with special needs who can't go to a private school, who have to go to a state school, and we are taking resources away from them. I want to give resources to all children, regardless of their parents' ability to pay.
I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question, if I can, from Matthew Scott.
Are we at risk of having a two-tier health system where the better off can afford to get private health care whilst the NHS suffers?
Kate?
We can ensure that we don't have a two-tier... challenge in our health service by one means and one means alone, raising the adequate revenue to reinvest in our public services. That is what this election and actually most issues tonight go back to. We've had 14 years of austerity. Most people in the UK are agreed that we want to see an end of that austerity, and that requires investment in our public services. Now, we have record funding in the Scottish NHS, we have record staffing levels, and yet we know that the Scottish NHS, like the NHS in Wales and England, is under extreme pressure, and we pay huge tribute to the staff that work in our NHS. But did you know that the amount of funding that Labour are promising the Scottish NHS is less than what the Tories gave us at the last year's budget? That is the stark reality of Labour's funding plans, and why I actually agree with Labour on this point. All roads lead back to Westminster. We need adequate funding in order to ensure that we reduce waiting lists, we have enough staffing, and that also raises a question about freedom of movement and the fact that so many of our staff right now are under pressure because we used to have access to Europe and the rest of the world, and both Labour and the Conservatives are absolutely dead cert in reducing immigration, which will inevitably have an impact on staffing levels.
So you're saying all roads lead back to Westminster. Health, as I'm sure you will all know here, perhaps not everyone necessarily knows it around the United Kingdom, health has devolved to Scotland. You're talking about austerity, which is, according to you, clearly is an issue across the United Kingdom. Why, therefore, is it that the average time to start chemotherapy in England is 48 days? It's 65 in Scotland. Why is it in Scotland there are 7,000 people who've waited more than 2 years for treatment? In England, it's just over 200 waits over 2 years.
We don't want anybody to be waiting.
But why is it worse here? There are things that are better here, I can see. But why are those things worse than they are in England?
Well, we don't want anybody to be waiting any longer. Our A&E is also the best performing across the UK. So, we have to ensure that the funding is going in there. Now, there's no doubt, if you look at the figures, because you've been sharing figures with me, there's no doubt that under the SNP, investment in our NHS has doubled. We also have record staffing. The key here is to ensure that the funding is going in the right places, and we have a plan in terms of reducing those waiting lists. But again, I go back. We're on a trajectory right now to improve those times.
OK, all right.
We're struggling after COVID. And the next administration will either make that easier or harder.
So Kate's speaking about a trajectory. They've been in government for 17 years. They've been in charge of the health service here in Scotland for 17 years, and things are getting worse. Kate mentioned A&E waiting times. They haven't met their own target for A&E waiting times since 2020. For 4 years, they're not meeting their targets. We are seeing 1 in 7 Scots, over 800,000 Scots, on an NHS waiting list. All of us who represent constituents on a daily basis hear horror stories about people having to go private, pay huge amounts of their own money. I've had examples just in the last couple of days about people waiting hours and hours to receive an ambulance when they call for an emergency, and then when the ambulance does arrive, despite the outstanding care they get, they're then stuck outside hospitals.
Clearly that is not unique to Scotland.
No, but we are here in Scotland and we're dealing with the NHS here in Scotland. And Kate has to be responsible for the last 17 years.
I've only got about 6 minutes left. I know you all want to say something and I want to hear about it. I also want to quickly get in some of the audience as well. Man here in the white shirt.
Kate, can you please answer a question with a straight answer, rather than avoiding throughout the whole night? You've sat there and avoided every answer. Only 2 parties have spoke.
I didn't hear that, sorry.
Sorry, what did you say?
The only 2 parties that have spoke openly are sitting to your left and right.
And you're saying Kate's not answering
Just answer the questions that you've been asked, yeah.
All right, man here in the front here.
Hi there. You've had 17 years since 2007 to govern Scotland, and the education attainment gap has gotten wider. There's eye hospital that's due to be opened that hasn't been opened yet, and we are the drug death capital of Europe in Scotland. I mean, your obsession is about independence. You've had £500 million of EU money sent back because you didn't spend the money. I mean, my point is, you talk about independence. If you can't govern Scotland as a devolved country, what chances do you have of governing Scotland as an independent country?
So the question I think we have to ask ourselves, are we going to talk about the symptoms, or are we going to talk about the causes? If we were having this conversation in Cardiff, if we're having this conversation somewhere in England, the challenges being expressed about the health service would be the same. And that, as I said earlier, tells me that this is not a localised problem, it's a systemic problem. And the way to solve the systemic problem is to change the ideology which has seen public service spending squeezed. And one of the reasons why there's pressure on the health service is because spending has been squeezed in local government, it's been squeezed in the justice system, and all the problems are being piled onto the NHS. So what we need from a Labour government that's going to come in a few weeks' time, it's not just the tinkering around taxes, we need something which is substantial. And we need pressure on that Labour government from the left, I would say, in order for it to make some of the decisions that are necessary on taxation and on reform of the public service, which are going to transform services here in Scotland, services in England, services in Wales. So certainly, point the finger of blame at the SNP, but also understand that there's a deeper cause to this.
You need to be bolder, Anna. That's what Stephen's saying.
Your colleague Nick Robinson yesterday asked John Swinney a straight question. Who sets the NHS's budget in Scotland and who's responsible for its delivery? And his answer was the Scottish Government. Kate Forbes and John Swinney are responsible with the SNP for the NHS. And let's talk about the human toll of their failure to properly manage our NHS, the two-tier system that the lady that asked the question asked about. In the last year, 1,500 Scots have had to pay £16,000 to get a knee replacement. 3,000 Scots have had to find £14,000 to get a hip replacement. My first job was in the NHS as a dentist. 4 out of 5 dental practices in Scotland no longer accept NHS patients. That's the human toll of this two-tier system. We're in the middle of a cost of living crisis, when people's mortgages have gone up by £2,000, the energy bills have doubled, and food prices up 20%. People have got to remortgage their homes, borrow money from friends and family in order to pay for treatment. But the point Stephen's making is that Labour aren't being bold enough. Made by Kate Forbes and the SNP
Stephen's making
on the
the point
NHS.
that Labour is not being bold enough to try and tackle these.
And what I would say is
tinkering around the edges.
But we have been really clear. That's why straight away, and these are our first steps, straight away, we would close the non-dom tax loopholes on the super rich to put more money into our NHS, and that would fund 160,000 more appointments every single year here in Scotland, when we have 840,000 Scots stuck on a waiting list because of the performance of the SNP. That's a starting point. But look, we can't have every excuse going back to Westminster. The system and the delivery here is the responsibility of the SNP. And you asked about systemic change. Actually, we can make systemic change here. Let's have a proper workforce plan, one we've not had for over 10 years. Why do we need 50 boards for a population of 5.5 million people? We should have fewer bureaucrats, fewer managers, and more doctors and more nurses in our NHS. We could make that change tomorrow if we wanted to.
So very directly, do we have a two-tier health system? We absolutely have a two-tier health system. And I feel this very personally, Fiona. 3 days after my father died 3 years ago, the Scottish Ambulance Service kept my grieving mother waiting 13 hours overnight for an ambulance to arrive. I will never forget that. I will never forget the failure and the centralisation of the Scottish ambulance system by the SNP government for failing my mother and no doubt countless other people. We have a two-tier system. Ideology has centralised the health system in this country, and we need change and we need investment.
30 seconds more. Do you want to answer some of that?
I don't think there is any doubt that our public services are under enormous pressure. I also participate in the NHS. I benefit from the NHS. I feel like with a toddler, I've spent more time in the NHS over the last year than I have spent in my whole life. Our NHS is under pressure and our workers do an incredible job. And I think this is where I would agree that we need to go back to the root cause. And we can't skirt around this. We have to understand what the root cause is. And ultimately, what most doctors and nurses tell me, we need more funding. OK, I'm going to have to end it there, I'm afraid, because our hour is up. Thank you to the panel. Apologies to all of you who had your hands up and I wasn't able to come to you, but thank you so much for all your questions. Thank you to you at home for watching. Thank you to Nicholas Fletcher, who supplied these lovely pictures of Edinburgh. No hardship, because it is one of the most beautiful cities, it has to be said. Good luck to Scotland.
Here, here.
Yes. Yeah, tomorrow night against Germany in the Euros. A lot of excitement about that in the Question Time team. And see you next week in York. Bye-bye.